Okay, welcome to the last lecture in our unit on thermodynamics. This is section 17.4, which deals with instantaneous reaction rates and reaction mechanisms. Instantaneous rates are basically the rate of decomposition at a specific time. So the reason why we call it decomposition is because most reactions are slowing down as the reaction progresses. And this is illustrated by this curve you see here on the right. Notice how the rate starts off pretty fast and it kind of begins to taper off. This is mainly because we're consuming reactants, and forming product. It's harder for the remaining reactants to collide with other reactants because now you have a mixture of not only reactants purely, but you also have products that are in the way, kind of preventing collisions from happening. So this is one of the reasons why we see the typically with the reaction curve, it tends to flatten out as time progresses. The way we find the rate of reaction at any point on this little curve is to take the slope of the straight line tangent, and you can see here it's steep in the beginning, which implies that you're going to have a big rate here, whereas over here it's a little flatter. The slope is in comparison, so the rate would be a little less as a result. Another way to calculate instantaneous rates is to actually use the rate law. If you actually have numbers and you know the the value, the order of the reaction and the value of k as well. And it's important to note again that the rate is changing constantly as the reaction continues to go forward. So how do you calculate instantaneous rates? Well, we're going to do it this way by looking at the rate law. So everything you see here has to be given to you in the problem. So they tell us that it's first order for H, it's second order for NO. So there's our M and our N. This is the value of K. This is our reaction, and these are the concentrations at which we want to know the rate of. So basically it's just a plug and chug thing. We know the rate law is going to be K times the concentration of NO to the second power since it's second order, and then times H2 to the first power since H is first order. Then what we do is we substitute and solve, and this is our rate for our reaction. So hopefully that's pretty easy to do. And there are other variants that we'll talk about how to do in class. Mechanisms. Mechanisms are basically a complete sequence of small elementary steps that make up a complex reaction. So a lot of reactions that we write in one step don't necessarily take just one step. Most reactions consist of two or more simpler reactions. To give you an example, if you remember your biology, we talk about the breakdown of glucose to create ATP, carbon dioxide, and water, right? We can write it out as a combustion reaction, right? Where it's C6H12O6 plus, I'm not going to balance it, plus O2 gives you CO2 and H2O, right? So this is the overall reaction for the breakdown of glucose, right? Plus you get some energy. But those of you who know the sorry about that. For those of you who know the process of glycolysis, of the Krebs cycle, of electron transport, you guys know that there are a bunch of smaller steps that add up to this overall reaction. So we could say, like, the process of glycolysis, 2 turns of the Krebs cycle, and electron transport represent the mechanism of the combustion of glucose inside cells. So this mechanism idea isn't so far removed from things that we've learned before, not only in this class but in other classes. So each step of a mechanism is known as an elementary step. So this is a simpler reaction that is part of the overall mechanism. A complex reaction is a reaction consisting of 2 or more steps. Now there are things known as intermediates and things that are catalysts that show up in these mechanisms. An intermediate, basically it's something that's produced in one elementary step and is consumed in a subsequent step. So these are things that don't show up in the overall reaction but are created and and broken down in different elementary steps. So for instance, as we transition from glycolysis to Krebs cycle, most of you guys remember acetyl-CoA, right? It breaks down through the process of the Krebs cycle, so that's why we would consider that an intermediate. Okay, and then basically anything that was in glycolysis or Krebs would be an intermediate. Catalysts, basically, sometimes in these reaction mechanisms are represented as reactants, but then are recreated as products later on. So catalysts can, in chemical mechanisms, can be consumed in a step but recreated in another step. Intermediates are the opposite. They're created in a step and then consumed in another step. So try and keep that in mind. For those, and this is more information for some of you who are going to be hopefully with me next year in AP Chemistry, but I know a lot of you won't, which makes me very sad. So here's an example of a simple sample mechanism. So there are 3 elementary steps that make up this overall reaction. So here, this is the complex or reaction that we're actually interested in. Here what ends up happening though is the Cl is actually the catalyst, the ClO and the O, those are actually intermediates. So notice how this is a catalyst. CATALYST, and then the ClO and the O are intermediates. So I'll just use I because I really can't spell intermediate, at least not with the mouse anyway. So see how this is on the left hand side and then it gets consumed later on. So that's the signature feature of a catalyst. Whereas intermediates will first show up or emerge on the right hand side and they could get consumed in later steps. Overall though, once you eliminate the catalysts and the intermediates, this is the overall reaction. These are the reactants and these are the products. Okay? So here is our mechanism. You're probably wondering, well, why do we care about the mechanism? Well, not every mechanism we propose is necessarily the correct one. The rate law data that we have has to actually match up with our mechanism. And I'll get a little bit, I'll kind of relate more to that in a second. But rate determining steps, so if I go back to my mechanism, if we measure, we can actually measure the rate of each of these elementary steps. So what we would find is that one out of these 3 would be the slowest step, and the slowest step out of your elementary steps would be your rate determining step. So what we find is that complex reactions like this, their rates are dependent upon the slowest step, so it limits how fast your reaction can go, and the rate law is based upon the rate determining step. Here are a couple energy diagrams, and so sometimes we can look at the energy diagrams of our elementary steps and that can give us an indication of what's the rate determining step. The rate determining step is always the part of our energy diagram that has the highest peak. So if we look at this one on the right that's in red, notice how there are 2 peaks, 1 and 2. This means that for this reaction, the energy profile is showing that this complex reaction takes place in 2 elementary steps, and that the second step is the rate determining step. So R, D, that's an awful D, S for rate determining step. Okay, so the reaction can only go as fast as step 2. Step 1 doesn't take a lot of energy in comparison to step 2. So step 1 is what we consider fast, and step 2 would be the slow one. Over here on the right we have a more complicated mechanism. So here we have 3 peaks. So this is an example of a 3-step complex reaction. So 3 elementary steps. And again, the highest peak is step 2. So step 2 is the rate determining step. Step 2 isn't always the rate determining step, it just happens to be in these 2 examples. In comparison to 2, 1 and 3 are faster. This is illustrated here by this sample rate determining step. So let's go back and let's say this is our complex reaction. And let's say this mechanism that I'm proposing takes place in 3 steps. And the second step is the slow step. Okay, so notice how, again, the slow steps and the fast steps add up to the complex reaction. And again, you can see the creation of some intermediates, right? Do you see them? So notice the N2O2 and the N2O are our intermediates. So notice how they get eliminated as part of the process. So here and here. And there should be a plus there that I forgot. The slow step again determines the rate law. So this is the rate law, and it's based upon this thing here. Now you're probably wondering why, if the rate law is based upon the reactants, why is N2O2 not expressed here? The reason why it's not expressed, and this is again more of an advanced thing, this is not necessarily for all of you to know. The reason why it's not included is because rate laws can only be based upon reactants that actually show up in the complex reaction. You cannot have intermediates showing up in your rate laws. So I have to go backwards because the creation of N2O2 is ultimately dependent upon this. So that's why this is included, but this is not. And again, it's just a little advanced thing, just to kind of give you a more complete picture of what's going on. Also remember, and I don't know if I emphasized this enough earlier, but all rate laws are based upon reactant concentrations, not product concentrations. And we will practice a lot of this in class, and hopefully what seems confusing will kind of become more clear as we work in class and prepare, as we learn how to do some of these different kinds of problems. So I will see you next time.